anybody didn't sign on at the very start, then they can hopefully see what they missed. So, so far we've talked about solving by factoring. Solving by, and I'm going to backtrack real quick. This one right here, sometimes I'll refer to that as like PEMDAS backwards, or sometimes we call it extracting the square roots because you took a square root right away. Also, it's just algebraically. This is our completing the square example. There is our steps for completing the square. I just want to see real quick. We're going to do quadratic formula, a couple graphically, and then we're done. Okay, so almost done with notes. We'll get through these pretty quick, and then friends at home, feel free to sign off. Don't forget, though, that tomorrow you have a Google Meet, so check your Google Calendar so that you can do that. Sure thing. There you go. So if you weren't quite done writing that, there's that. Then we're going to solve using the quadratic formula. So I have 3x squared minus 6x equals 5. And when we solve using quadratic formula, it's kind of like solving by factoring and solving by graphing has to be set equal to 0. So off to the side here, I'm just going to do a little reminder. Needs to be set equal to 0. That looks like a set minus 0. Set equal to 0. So when I said this one, that 5 is off by itself. I have to move that 5 back. So I'm going to subtract the 5 from both sides. That gives me 3x squared minus 6x minus 5 equals 0. Then we need to remember our quadratic formula. Remember, quadratic just means that you've got an x squared term, an x term, and a constant term. A is always your number in front of your x squared term. B is always your number in front of your x term. C is your constant term. Quadratic formula was that big, huge formula that you had to use, substitute things in, and then simplify. Depending on who you had for intermediate, they may have taught you intermediate algebra. They may have taught you a song to this. Sometimes it's the Pop Goes the Weasel. Anybody heard that song? Your x equals opposite b. Okay. So if you can remember that, great. You will need to know quadratic formula for this class. So make sure if you don't know your quadratic formula that you've got it. Quadratic formula is this right here. Oops, I need to write it correctly. Let me fix that. B squared minus 4ac. Okay, so now, depending on who your most recent teacher was, I believe Mrs. Anderson, if you had Mrs. Anderson, she separates it out and she says x equals negative b over 2a and then plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, so there's like two separate fractions. That is the exact same equivalent to this. I write it this way. Instead of saying x equals negative b, which a lot of people call it negative b, I say the opposite of b because I want you to remember that if b was negative, you have to take the opposite and you need to make it positive. So yeah, so there's our quadratic formula. You don't need to write this. I'm just trying to be really obvious because I know that last year sometimes our math classes we don't remember the best. So my a is 3. My b is my number in front of my x, that's negative 6. My c is a negative 5. You need to write that down when you do your homework notes. What I do want to see when you're doing your homework is I want to see this next step where you actually start substituting it into the formula. So when I solve, I'm going to say x equals, I want the opposite of b. Right now my b is a negative 6, so I want positive 6. Plus or minus the square root of, I usually do this step if I can in my head, b squared. So negative 6 times negative 6 would be a positive 36. The reason why I do that one, or I force myself to do that one in my head, a lot of times people write this, and then they go to their calculator and they type in negative 6 squared, and it tells them that it's a negative 36 because they didn't realize that they should have done this and put it in parentheses. So I just make myself, if I can, multiply it in my head so that I know when negative turns to positive. Minus 4 times my a times my c And I have to make sure that it's all over 2 times a. Then I'm just going to do a little bit of simplifying here. I'll get to that square in just a second here. 2 times 3 is 6. So I know this much so far. And then I'm going to go to my calculator and type in 36 minus 4 times 3 times negative 5. I can type everything that was under that square root. I didn't type the square root, but I typed everything else. And I get 96. Now, a couple of ways that you can write this. If you have a square root in your answer, I want you to either write in what's called simplest radical form, meaning if you can reduce that square root of 96, please reduce it, or just write it as a decimal. I'm going to do this as a decimal, but here's how I do this as a decimal. I have to do positive 6 plus the square root of 96. I have to hit enter because I need all of that divided by 6. That gives me about 2.63. And then I have to take 6 minus the square root of 96 divided by 6, and that gives me a negative 0.63. Okay, so there's using our quadratic formula. Only because I'm thinking ahead for like Schoology and stuff like that. I don't think there's an easy way if it was like a fill-in-the-blank question for Schoology to put a square root. So if I were you, I'd just plan on rounding those to the decimal. Okay. Okay, the last one that I want to go through, I think. Oh, nope, not the last, second to last one. Solve graphically. This one's no longer a quadratic. This is a cubic. It's a graphically one, so we're not going to really show a lot of work. I just want to make sure that you can find everything that you need to find on ones like this for graphs. Okay. So I'm going to go to my calculator. I'm going to go to y equals and type in x to the third minus x minus 1. Once I have that typed in, then I'm going to go to my graph. We will discover this. I'm trying to think what section it is. Probably, actually, it might be tomorrow already. Well, kind of. Throughout this semester, we will talk about, okay, if your biggest exponent is a 3, that means that you can have up to 3 zeros, 3 times that it crosses my x-axis. Does this one cross 3 times? No, that's okay. That just means it can't cross more than 3. So this one only crosses once, which means that there's only one answer that I'm looking for, and it's that point right there. So I'm going to do that second calculate 0 like we did at the start of class today. Go to the left, go to the right, and I get that number right there. I'm going to say it's about 1.32. And that's it. You might look at it and be like, how does it cross 3 times? If I shifted that graph up, then it would cross 3 times. Yep. X, and then arrow out. Okay. There you go. Yep. The newer calculators are really nice because it actually shows you that as the exponent. But then once you type in that exponent, you have to actually use your arrow keys to get out of that exponent when you're typing it in there. Okay, last one. You don't necessarily have to even write this one down. I just want to make sure that you know how to do this one. So we're going to do this one in our calculator as well. The method that we've been using so far is called to solve these is our zero method. I'm going to show you one other method that you can use on your calculator to solve. This one is not set equal to 0. It would not be a lot of work to set it equal to 0. What would you have to do to set that equal to 0? You just have to subtract the 6, and then you could still do the second calculate 0. So that absolutely would be a possibility. The other option is you could go like this. Type everything that's on the left-hand side in Y1. Type everything in the right-hand side into Y2. Absolute values, if you go to math, I believe if you just arrow down, or maybe it's under, nope, I haven't done it for a while. Arrow over 1 to where it says N num for numbers, and ABS. means absolute value. The newer calculators will actually look like a set of absolute values. And I'm going to say 2x minus 1. For my calculator, I just put a parenthesis to say here's where the absolute value ends. For the newer ones, arrow out of it, and then it'll put that end one there. And then under y2, I'm truly just going to hit 6. When I graph this, I'm no longer going to look for zeros because it's not set equal to 0. I'm going to look, when does this absolute value graph have the same numbers as this graph, which is just a 6. Anybody remember what an absolute value graph looks like? Maybe you already graphed it. Absolute value should be a V-shaped graph. So when I say, when does this absolute value graph have the same value as this, I'm really looking for that point and that point right there. I already know the y values for those points. They're 6 because we said when does it is what. Go to math, right down here, and then arrow over 1 to number, the very first one. Yep. I just want to find those x values. I can't use second calculate 0 because it's not a 0. There won't be a sign change. But what I can do is I can go to option 5 and I can go to intersect. Tell me where those two lines cross. So I'm going to go option 5. I have to get close to my intersection, but now it's giving us different directions. It's not saying left bound, right bound. It's saying first curve, and it's going to say second curve. Since I could technically type into like up to 10 y equals equations, they want to verify that these are the two lines we're using, even though there's only 2 lines that we put in this. So notice when I scroll, it tells me I'm on y1, which is the absolute value equation, and I'm just going to be on that line, arrow left or right as close as I can, and hit enter. And when I hit enter, it's not as easy to see, but it jumped to the next equation. Now see up at the top left of that screen, it says y2. So it's saying, is this the second curve that you want? If you had a third equation in there that you wanted instead, if I hit up or down in this menu, it actually keeps jumping between my 2 equations. So I have to make sure that my second curve is on y2. Hit enter. Do I want to guess? No. And it tells me, oh, it crosses there at negative 2.5. I don't need the y value because we already know that's 6. So I'm going to say x equals negative 2.5. Then I just repeat, second, calculate, intersect. Now I have to use the right arrow key, which a lot of people try to use the up and down key because they're like, oh, look, I'm really low, so I'm going to try and get up there. But if you keep hitting up, it just keeps jumping back and forth. So I'm going to use the arrow key instead. And then my second intersection is at 3.5. So on your homework today, if I can find this. On your homework today, we took notes. We are doing some quick review problems, and then 7 through 67, just the odds, which I realize is still a lot of problems. Some of them will be asking you just to solve by graphing. The graphing ones, you don't need to show any work. So even though I said you must show your work, graphing ones I realize you're doing on your calculator. There's no work to be shown. You don't even need to write the original equation if you don't want to. Okay? But ones that are like completing the square, if all you have are your answers, I will not be giving you points for that on that. On our chapter test, which will be next week, Monday, I believe I had said, there will be on the paper copy, on the one where you have to show your work, there will be a question where I specifically say, solve by factoring. And I want to make sure that you know how to solve by factoring. And then there'll be one that says, solve by completing the square. And then I want to see you complete the square, or solve by quadratic formula. So practice these methods here. For this first review chapter, I am going to be particular about which method you use to solve because I want to make sure you can do all of them. After this chapter, then I'll just give you a quadratic and I'll say either solve algebraically, solve graphically, and then I don't care if you solve by completing the square or solve by quadratic formula or solve by factoring or solve by extracting the square root, whichever is easier. Okay, so this chapter, make sure you practice those. Okay, that is it. So my friends online, thank you for joining us, but you are